Why was the silence louder than gunfire? She crouched in the shadow of a crumbling wall, her breath tight, her heartbeat too steady for the chaos around her. Silence wasn't new to her. She had lived in it, trained in it, buried herself inside it for years. But tonight it pressed against her ribs like a weight she couldn't shrug off. Ahead of her, half hidden by rain and dust, the objective loomed. A compound scarred by bullet holes and time. Lantern light flickered weakly behind its barred windows, spilling out in broken slices. Somewhere inside that building was the man they'd been sent for. A name whispered across briefing rooms, linked to bombings, disappearances, lives cut short. But that wasn't the face that haunted her. Her hand brushed the pocket on her chest, where the corner of a folded photograph pressed against her skin. She carried it into every mission, tucked close like a secret no one could pry loose. Her team didn't know. Command didn't know. No one did. She wasn't carrying just orders tonight. She was carrying something far heavier. Behind her, 2 blocks down the deserted street, her team waited for her signal. 4 shadows holding their breath with hers. Ramirez, the medic, always steady, his eyes lined by years of fatigue and a wife's worried letters. O'Neill, the quiet one, a radio man who barely spoke but always listened, his brother's dog tags hidden beneath his vest. Carter, too young, too eager, too desperate to belong, with questions that clawed at him even when he pretended not to care. And Hale, their point man, steady as a mountain, his calm masking a grief he never spoke aloud. They trusted her to lead them into this fire and out again. She never asked for their trust, but it followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. So why did it feel like every step she took tonight was carrying her closer, not just to the target, but to the truth she had been avoiding? The rain thickened, turning dust into mud. A toy lay half buried at her feet, a soldier made of cheap plastic, its arm snapped off. She stared at it longer than she should have. A reminder of lives lived here before war consumed them. A reminder that children used to laugh in these streets. Her chest tightened. She forced herself to look away, to breathe past the knot in her throat. Not here, not now. She raised her fist. Behind her, shadows shifted. Her team moved, slow and silent, every step rehearsed, every motion born of discipline. But their hearts, she knew each one carried noise of its own. Regrets, memories, questions they never dared voice. She felt them pressing against her back as she slipped closer to the compound. The door groaned as she pushed it open. The sound was too sharp, cutting the silence like a blade. She froze, breath held. No response. Not yet. She slipped inside, rifle pressed to her shoulder. The air was thick with oil smoke and the faint tang of sweat. Shadows danced along peeling walls. Somewhere above, boots scraped against wooden floors. Laughter muted by distance. The sound of bottles clinking. She scanned corners, every nerve awake, every sense sharpened. Then she heard it. Not the rough voices of men, not the shuffle of weapons, but a cough, small, fragile. Her breath caught. It wasn't in the briefing, wasn't in the plan. Her eyes darted to the corner, and there he was, a boy no older than 7, curled up behind an overturned table, eyes wide, cheeks pale with dust. He clutched a fraying blanket to his chest, his thin shoulders rising and falling too fast. For a moment, her world stopped. She had trained for raids, extractions, firefights in alleys and mountains. But nothing had prepared her for this, for a child in the middle of a battlefield, looking at her with a mixture of terror and something else. Something she couldn't name. Her finger hovered near the trigger. Not for him, for the boots above. If he cried out, if he gave her away, the mission would collapse in seconds. But if she moved closer, if she spoke, he might cry anyway. Her chest constricted. She wanted to tell him not to be afraid, that she wasn't here for him, that she had a daughter once who smiled like that, before the silence of distance swallowed their lives whole. But she couldn't. The mission was everything. She lowered the rifle just enough to let him see her eyes, not the weapon, not the uniform, just her. The boy froze, his lips trembled, but he didn't scream, didn't move. Then boots, heavy, descending the stairs, voices harsh, sharp. The laughter upstairs died, replaced by a sudden tension. Her body tensed, the silence shattered. 3 men stormed down, rifles slung, words thick and impatient. She dropped low, her body moving before thought could catch up. The first shot cracked, muzzle flash lighting the room in blinding bursts. 2 men fell, their bodies twisting. The third staggered back, shouting. The boy didn't make a sound. Her team surged in behind her, shadows turning into fire and motion. Ramirez's steady bursts, O'Neill whispering into his headset, Carter wide-eyed but fast, too fast, almost reckless. Hale, silent as stone, moving with lethal precision. The firefight was chaos, thunder echoing off crumbling walls. Smoke clawed at her lungs, her vision splitting between targets and the boy in the corner. Always the boy, watching her, judging her, a silent witness to choices he couldn't understand. It ended as suddenly as it began. Bodies fell into silence. The compound's lower floor lay broken, lit only by the weak lantern still flickering in the corner. Her team panted in the aftermath, sweat streaking their faces. Carter's hands shook, though he tried to hide it. Ramirez swore under his breath. O'Neill murmured coordinates into his radio. She lowered her weapon slowly. The boy hadn't moved. Her team didn't see him, didn't ask. They were too busy, too caught in the rhythm of survival, but she did, she saw him. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The mission wasn't just about removing a name from a list, erasing a man who had haunted maps and briefings. It was about the weight she chose to carry afterward. And she knew the hardest choice of this night hadn't come yet. They pushed deeper into the compound, step by step. Shadows stretched across walls like scars, every corner threatening to break into violence again. But her thoughts lingered in the room behind her. The boy's eyes had followed her, wide and unblinking, as if trying to memorize her face. And pressed against her heart, the photograph burned. Her silence had always been her armor. Tonight, it felt like it might finally break. What was worse, the enemy in front of her, or the silence she carried behind her? The compound felt alive with echoes. Every hallway hummed with the ghosts of those who had lived here, fought here, died here. Her boots pressed against cracked tiles, the sound muffled by the layers of dust that had settled like a shroud. The lanterns gave off a dim glow, flickering as if uncertain whether to cling to life or surrender to the dark. Her team moved in formation. Ramirez to her right, steady and calm, eyes sweeping corners with the precision of a man who had spent half his life pulling others back from the edge. O'Neill behind them, whispering into his headset, his words clipped, efficient, reporting their progress to the command center miles away. Hale, ever the anchor, scanning their rear with eyes sharp as knives. And Carter, too quick, too nervous, rifle trembling slightly every time the shadows shifted. She had told herself 100 times not to think of the boy they had left in the corner, but his wide, unblinking eyes clung to her, watching, judging, silent. She wanted to believe she had done the right thing, leaving him untouched, leaving him breathing. But the photograph in her pocket made the choice heavier, because the face in that photograph belonged to a girl about his age, a girl whose voice she hadn't heard in months, maybe years, except in dreams. Her silence tightened around her like a noose. A noise broke it. Upstairs, a door slammed. Boots shuffled, hurried voices rising in alarm. The firefight below had not gone unnoticed. Their element of surprise was gone. She raised her hand, signaling a halt. Her team froze in place, rifles lifted, breaths held. The dim light painted their faces in lines of tension. She pointed toward the stairs. Hale nodded, moving ahead with the deliberate calm of a man who had never let panic dictate his steps. She followed close behind, every nerve alive, every muscle taut. The staircase groaned under their weight. Each step felt like a countdown. Halfway up, Carter whispered, "What if they've—" She cut him off with a glance. Silence. The boy didn't scream, neither would Carter, not tonight. They reached the landing. A hallway stretched before them, lined with broken doors. At the far end, a glow of light spilled out, voices tangled together in low urgency. She edged forward, pressing her shoulder to the wall. Ramirez behind her, steady as stone. The smell of sweat and cigarettes thickened with every step. And then laughter, not nervous, not fearful, mocking. Her stomach twisted. They weren't afraid, not yet. She glanced back at her team. 4 sets of eyes met hers, waiting for the choice only she could make. Breach now, wait for the target to reveal himself, or pull back and risk losing everything. The silence inside her screamed for an answer. She leaned in closer, her ear brushing the frame of the doorway. Through the thin wood she heard a man's voice, deep, commanding, the name from the briefing, the man they had come for. Her hand tightened around her rifle. But something in his tone caught her off guard. Not fear, not arrogance. A strange calm, as if he knew they were here, as if he had been waiting. She nodded to Hale, 3 fingers raised, 2, 1. The door burst inward. Chaos ignited. Shouts erupted. Muzzle flashes split the dark. The room exploded in motion. Men scrambling, overturning tables, rifles jerking toward the doorway. Her team surged inside, cutting through the storm with trained precision. Ramirez fired. Hale dropped 2 before they could rise. O'Neill shouted positions into his comms. Carter moved too fast, nearly stumbling, but found his mark. She entered last. And there he was. The target, sitting not 10 feet from her, a lantern casting sharp shadows across his face. His eyes met hers, calm, almost resigned. He didn't lift his weapon, didn't shout orders, he just watched her. And for one heartbeat, she hesitated. Why wasn't he fighting? Why wasn't he running? Her silence roared inside her. Do it, Ramirez barked, voice cutting through the gunfire. But she didn't, not yet. Because the man's eyes, dark, steady, were not the eyes of someone cornered. They were the eyes of someone who knew a secret, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she needed to know what it was. The firefight burned around her, but in that space between her breath and his silence, the world narrowed. Then he spoke, just one line. You carry more than your orders. Her blood ran cold. How could he know? She lifted her rifle, her finger trembling on the trigger, but the hesitation lingered, sharp as a blade against her throat. And that's when everything fell apart. The explosion ripped through the floor beneath them. Wood splintered, walls buckled, the lantern shattered into shards of fire. Her body lifted, thrown hard against the wall. Her ears rang, vision blurred, air punched from her lungs. Smoke swallowed the room. Shouts tangled with groans. Dust rained from the ceiling like ash. Her rifle was gone, her chest burned. She clawed her way up, blinking against the haze. Through the chaos she saw him, the target, still alive, crawling toward a back exit she hadn't seen. She forced herself forward, muscles screaming, but before she could reach him, a hand gripped her arm. Ramirez, his face streaked with blood, pulling her back from a beam threatening to collapse. His voice cut through the ringing. We have to move, now. Carter stumbled nearby, coughing, his face pale beneath layers of soot. O'Neill dragged him upright, barking words she couldn't hear. Hale was already moving, herding them toward a breach in the wall where air rushed in. The target was slipping away. Her silence screamed again. The photograph burned against her chest. She tore free of Ramirez's grip, pushing toward the collapsing hallway. She couldn't let him vanish, not when his words still echoed inside her. But the ceiling groaned, the walls buckled, the choice tore at her. Follow the man who might hold the truth, or save the lives of the men who trusted her with theirs. Her breath shook, her boots froze. And in that terrible pause, the target disappeared into the smoke. They stumbled out into the night, broken, bleeding, alive. Behind them, the compound crumbled, fire licking its bones. The rain hissed against the flames, turning smoke into steam. Her team collapsed against the rubble, gasping for air. Ramirez pressed a hand to his ribs, wincing. Carter bent over, retching into the mud. O'Neill's hand shook as he fumbled with his comms. Hale leaned against a wall, silent, his chest rising in heavy beats. She stood apart, watching the fire devour what was left. She had failed. The target was alive. And worse, the last thing he had said to her still pulsed in her chest. "You carry more than your orders." How had he known? The photograph in her pocket felt heavier than her rifle. He hadn't seen it, couldn't have. But somehow he had spoken directly into the silence she thought was hers alone. Ramirez limped to her side. "We'll get another shot," he said, his voice tired but firm. "We did what we could." She didn't answer, because the silence inside her knew the truth. The war wasn't over, it had just shifted. And now it was personal. How do you lead when your silence has already failed? The night was heavy with smoke. Rain pattered against ash and rubble, steam rising where fire had eaten through wood and flesh alike. She stood at the edge of the ruins, the heat of the collapsing compound warming her face even as cold rain dripped from her helmet. The mission was broken. The target had slipped into the dark, carrying with him not just his life, but something else, something she didn't yet understand. Her team sat scattered across the street, exhausted, bloodied, silent. Ramirez leaned against a burned-out vehicle, pressing gauze to his ribs, his breathing uneven. O'Neill knelt by the comms pack, his hands trembling as he tried again to reestablish contact with command. Carter sat in the mud, his rifle across his lap, staring at the ground like a boy who had seen too much. Hale paced, steady but restless, his eyes flicking to the shadows as if expecting another ambush. She hadn't spoken since they'd stumbled out of the fire. Not when Ramirez asked if she was hurt. Not when O'Neill told her comms were dead. Not when Carter, his voice fragile, whispered, "What do we do now?" She just stared into the ruins, her chest rising and falling with the quiet rage of someone who knew she had let the war slip through her fingers. The man's words gnawed at her. "You carry more than your orders." How could he know, unless... Her hand drifted to the pocket over her heart, the photograph. It was still there, warm against her chest, edges crumpled from years of folding and unfolding. She hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Ramirez, the closest thing she had to a brother. The picture was hers alone, a small girl with bright eyes and a half-smile, the kind of smile that made the world seem softer, gentler. The smile she carried through deserts, jungles, and broken cities. The smile that reminded her why she fought, why she bled. But that man, her target, had looked at her as if he knew, as if he could see right through the silence she wrapped herself in. Ramirez grunted as he pushed himself upright, crossing the short distance between them. His voice was low, meant only for her. "We're not done yet, not by a long shot. He's out there. We'll get another chance." She didn't look at him, couldn't. "We shouldn't have let him go." Ramirez gave a humorless chuckle. "You think I wanted him slipping through? I've buried too many brothers because of that man's games, but we're still breathing. That counts for something." Her silence deepened. Breathing wasn't enough, not tonight. Carter's voice cracked through the quiet, fragile and desperate. What if we weren't meant to catch him tonight? What if it's bigger than us?" The boy's question hung in the air. Hale's packing stopped. O'Neill finally looked up from his comms. Even Ramirez, usually unshaken, frowned. "Bigger than us." The thought lingered like smoke. She turned her head, finally meeting Carter's eyes. He was young, his face pale beneath the grime, his hands shaking even as he gripped his rifle like it could anchor him. She saw herself in him, not in the eagerness, not in the fear, but in the silence he was beginning to build around himself. She wanted to tell him something, anything, to cut through the terror he carried, but words had always failed her. Silence was easier, safer. Still, a fragment slipped out. "It's always bigger than us." The boy blinked, startled. It was the most she had spoken in hours. Before anyone could answer, O'Neill cursed under his breath. Comms are fried, we're blind. No command, no satellite link. We're on our own. The silence thickened. Alone, no eyes in the sky, no voice in their ear, no lifeline. Hale broke it, his voice sharp but controlled. Then we move, east. Secondary exfil is 6 clicks out. We'll regroup, reassess, call in support. Ramirez nodded. He's right, staying here's suicide. Reinforcements will come looking for him, and for us. She hesitated. Her silence begged her to stay, to hunt, to chase the man who had slipped away into the smoke. But another silence pressed harder, the silence of the men behind her, waiting for her choice. She gave a single nod, and they moved. The night swallowed them. They slipped through ruined alleys, boots sinking into mud, weapons raised. Every sound mattered, the distant crack of thunder, the hiss of rain against tin roofs, the faint shuffle of boots too far to be theirs. The city around them was broken, hollow, but alive in its own way. A dog barked in the distance, its echo carried down empty streets. Somewhere glass shattered. Somewhere a door slammed shut in fear. Every step was heavier than the last. Carter's breathing grew ragged, his nerves fraying. Ramirez limped but didn't complain. O'Neill kept scanning, his eyes darting too quickly, the weight of Com's failure pressing on him harder than any bullet could. Hale stayed steady, but she saw the tension in his jaw, the way his grip on his rifle never eased. She walked at the front, always, because that's what they expected of her. But inside, her silence cracked. The target's eyes, his words. You carry more than your orders. How could he know, unless someone had told him, unless someone had betrayed her? Her chest tightened, the photograph burned. Ramirez caught up to her, his voice low again. What's in your head? She kept her eyes forward. Nothing. He didn't believe her, he never did, but he didn't press. That was Ramirez, he knew silence when he saw it. They moved for another mile before the storm broke. Not rain, not thunder. Gunfire. From the rooftops, from the shadows, from the dark alleys, ambush. Bullets snapped past her head, sparks flaring as they struck stone. Carter yelped, stumbling into cover. Ramirez dropped low, returning fire with practiced bursts. Hale barked directions, his voice sharp and grounding. O'Neill scrambled for position, his rifle steady despite the fear in his eyes. She pressed against the wall, heart hammering, scanning the shadows. Figures moved in the distance, quick and deliberate. Too many, too organized. This wasn't chance, this was planned. They knew, they were waiting. Her silence turned into a roar inside her chest. The target hadn't run blind into the smoke. He had known exactly where to go. And now, so did his men. A bullet chipped the wall near her head, spraying dust into her eyes. She blinked hard, raised her rifle, fired. One shadow dropped, another rose. The street was fire and thunder. Her team fought, backs pressed to broken walls, breaths ragged. Carter's hands shook, but he fired, teeth clenched. Ramirez grunted, blood seeping through his side, but he kept moving, kept fighting. O'Neill's voice broke as he called targets, his calm fraying. Hale remained steady, his rifle spitting precise bursts. And her silent, focused, every shot a choice, every breath a battle. But even as she fought, her mind burned with one truth: someone had betrayed them. And until she knew who, none of them were safe. The ambush broke as suddenly as it began. Their attackers melted into the night, leaving only bodies and echoes. The street fell silent again. Her team staggered out from cover, bruised, bloodied, alive. Barely. Ramirez pressed a hand harder to his ribs, his breath shallow. Carter leaned against a wall, shaking, whispering curses under his breath. O'Neill's hands trembled too much to reload at first. Hale reloaded calmly, his face unreadable. She lowered her rifle, her chest heaving. But the silence inside her wasn't relief, it was suspicion. The target had spoken like he knew her. His men had waited like they knew her path. And that could mean only one thing: someone, somewhere, had given her away. Her orders weren't enough anymore. Trust wasn't enough anymore. Her silence was breaking. She sat motionless, her back against the cold stone wall, her rifle across her knees. The village below was deceptively quiet, lanterns glowing in windows, shadows moving behind curtains. To anyone else it looked like peace. To her trained eyes it was a map of intentions. The rooftops, the alleys, the places where someone could disappear in seconds. She was waiting because she had been told to wait. But patience was what weighed her down. It was what she had overheard hours earlier. Words not meant for her. Plans not written in her orders. Why hadn't they told her? The memory of the briefing gnawed at her. She had sat at the edge of the table, her presence acknowledged but never invited. The commander's voice had been steady, authoritative, but something in his tone when he spoke about acceptable losses had chilled her. Not all lives, it seemed, carried the same weight. She clenched her jaw because in that calculation, she knew whose names might have been written in invisible ink. The villagers. The women and children who would never know her name, who would only see the shadow of foreign boots on their soil. She looked down at her hands, remembering the scar across her knuckle. It wasn't from battle. It was from her father's workshop when she was 13 and learning how to hold tools too heavy for her small hands. Strength isn't in how tight you grip, he had told her, pressing her bleeding hand under cold water. It's in knowing when to hold on and when to let go. She had carried that lesson into every mission. But tonight, she didn't know which one it would be. The radio crackled softly. A voice came through, male, calm, too calm, confirm position. She pressed her mic once, no words. Silence was confirmation enough. Her handler knew her rhythm. But there was another voice behind his, muffled, almost as if it was leaning too close to the line. She caught fragments. Target moves tonight, no witnesses. Her chest tightened. That wasn't in her briefing. The wind picked up, rustling the tarps on a nearby rooftop. In the village, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. She knew that sound, signals. Someone was moving. She raised her scope, eyes adjusting, breath slowing, and there it was. A figure slipping from one shadow to another, not carrying a weapon, carrying a child. Her heart stopped. This wasn't an enemy. This was survival. A mother clutching her daughter, trying to slip past the invisible net of foreign eyes. And suddenly the calculations in that briefing weren't abstract anymore. Acceptable losses had a face, a trembling hand, a child who couldn't be more than 6. She should have looked away, should have let the moment pass. Orders were clear. Watch, record, report, nothing more. But her finger twitched against the trigger guard, not out of intent to fire, out of instinct to protect. Status, the radio pressed again. Her throat tightened. She could lie. She could say there was nothing. But she also knew if she didn't report, someone else watching another angle might. And then it wouldn't be her silence protecting them. It would be her silence condemning them. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her mind drifted back to when she was 12, standing at the gates of a refugee camp with her mother, waiting for her father who never walked back through those gates. The last image burned into her memory wasn't of him. It was of a soldier, faceless under a helmet, turning them away with a single raised hand. She had hated that silence, that indifference. It had carved her into who she was now. So she opened her eyes, she pressed the mic, and she lied. Negative movement, all clear. The words left her mouth steady, though her chest ached as if they had cost her breath itself. The radio stayed quiet for a beat too long, and she thought they might not believe her. But then, copy. She exhaled. The mother and child disappeared into the night. She watched until they were nothing but whispers of shadow against shadow. A part of her longed to follow, to make sure they truly escaped. But she couldn't. Not without betraying more than orders, not without exposing herself. Her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her scope. She hated that it trembled, not out of fear, but out of the realization of what she had just done. One small act, one lie, and yet it felt heavier than any bullet she had ever fired. Behind her, footsteps shuffled. She spun, rifle ready, but it was only Ramirez. His face was pale in the moonlight, sweat streaking through dust. "You heard it too, didn't you?" His voice was low, careful. He didn't look at her directly, just kept his eyes on the horizon. About no witnesses. She didn't answer. He sat down beside her, rubbing his temples. They're not telling us everything. We're not just here for one man. We're here to erase anything connected to him. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of realizing what that meant. Villagers, families. Her silence was answer enough. "Why are you still here then?" he asked finally. "Why do you keep carrying their orders?" She didn't know, or maybe she did, because walking away was harder than obeying. Because disobedience didn't just cost your career, it cost your identity. And yet, something inside her had already shifted. Down in the village, another door creaked open. Another shadow moved. The mission was only beginning, but her trust in it was already gone. And she wondered, if orders were written in blood, whose blood would they demand next? The night pressed in tighter, the silence louder. And as she steadied her rifle again, she realized she wasn't just watching the village anymore. She was watching herself. And she wasn't sure she liked what she saw. What does loyalty cost when the truth whispers louder than the orders? She lay in the dust outside the village, cheek pressed to the stock of her rifle. The night had stretched into morning, shadows retreating as the horizon bled pale light. Her eyes burned from hours without blinking, her body stiff from stillness. Yet it wasn't fatigue that gnawed at her. It was the memory of her own voice lying into the radio. That one quiet defiance had cracked something inside her, and cracks, she knew, had a way of spreading. She shifted slightly, adjusting the bipod in the dirt. The glass of her scope reflected the village in fragments, rooftops shimmering with heat, children running barefoot through narrow alleys, a man carrying water on his shoulders. Life, fragile but persistent. She tried to watch it as a soldier, as an operative detached from meaning. But her mind betrayed her, slipping back to a different alley, a different set of children. Herself among them, barely 10, running after her father's stride as he carried sacks of rice across checkpoints that never opened. She had wanted to believe that joining them, the military, the machine, was her way of making sure no one else was turned away. But sitting here now, waiting for orders wrapped in silence, she felt the sting of betrayal, not just from her commanders but from herself. A crunch of gravel behind her, Ramirez again. His steps were heavier this time, less cautious. He crouched beside her, his rifle slung but unused. He didn't look at her, not right away. Instead, he studied the same village she was watching, as if daring it to reveal secrets neither of them wanted to name. "They're going to move tonight," he said finally. His voice was hoarse, as though the words scraped his throat raw. "The target, that's why the order changed. No witnesses." Her stomach turned. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't want the details. She already understood. He leaned back, rubbing his face with dirty hands. "You ever wonder why we're always the last to know the real mission?" His laugh was hollow. "They call it compartmentalization. I call it being disposable." She stayed silent, her finger brushing the cool metal of her rifle. "You lied," he said suddenly, his tone cutting sharper. He looked at her then, eyes rimmed with exhaustion but clear. "Last night, I heard the mother, I saw her. You told command nothing moved." Her pulse jumped. She could have denied it, played the role they had all been taught to wear. But something in his gaze stopped her. He wasn't accusing. He was asking if she still carried a piece of her humanity intact. "Yes," she whispered. For a moment neither spoke. The wind carried dust between them. In the village below, laughter rose, children chasing a ball through the alley. It sounded so ordinary, so heartbreakingly ordinary. Ramirez sighed, lowering his head. "Then we're both compromised, because I didn't report it either." Her chest ached. In his words was a confession and a bond. They weren't alone in their silent rebellion, but it also meant they were tied together now, for better or worse. The radio hissed suddenly. A voice cut through, cold and mechanical. "Stand by for confirmation. Operation to commence at dusk. Eliminate the asset. No traces." No traces. She closed her eyes. She could already see it, the sweep through the village, the chaos, the screaming. And she knew dusk wasn't just the end of the day, it was the end of these people's lives. Her throat tightened. Orders had always been heavy, but never like this. Never with the weight of entire families pressed against her silence. Ramirez looked at her, his face pale. "We can't stop it, it's bigger than us." But his words trembled, as if daring her to argue. She thought of her father again, his hand steady on her shoulder, his voice steady when he told her that strength was knowing when to let go. She wondered if he had ever faced a choice like this, if he had ever betrayed himself for something larger than orders. Her hand drifted to the small photo tucked inside her vest. Her mother, younger, standing at the edge of that refugee gate. She had kept it hidden for years, afraid that sentiment would be seen as weakness. But right now, it felt like the only compass she could trust. She met Ramirez's eyes. "Maybe we can't stop everything, but we can stop something." He stared at her, searching, as if to measure the seriousness in her tone. Then he exhaled a shaky laugh. "You realize what you're saying? That's desertion, treason." "No," her voice was steady now. "That's survival, theirs, maybe ours." Silence stretched between them, heavy but alive. Below, the villagers carried on, unaware of the storm crawling toward them with each ticking second. She watched a young boy drag firewood, too heavy for his thin arms, and it struck her like a knife. He could have been her brother. He could have been her. She adjusted her scope again, but she wasn't looking for targets anymore. She was searching for paths, exits, places where shadows could move without being seen. The sun rose higher, its heat pressing down. Sweat stung her brow. Every second brought them closer to dusk. And with it, the moment she would have to decide whether she was a soldier or something else entirely. What happens when the line between mission and conscience disappears? The heat was suffocating by late afternoon. Dusk clung to her lips, her throat raw from silence. She hadn't moved in hours, but inside she felt restless, like her body was urging her to stand, to shout, to tear the headset from her ear and walk away. But she didn't. She stayed low, her rifle pointed toward the village that had no idea what waited for it when the sun fell. Ramirez lay a few meters away, pretending to sleep but never fully still. His hand stayed near his rifle, even as his chest rose and fell unevenly. She knew he wasn't resting. He was carrying the same weight she was. They both were. She swallowed hard, scanning the rooftops again. Children had vanished indoors, the streets quieting as if instinct warned them of dusk. Her gut tightened. Even silence can sound like a warning. The radio crackled. A voice came through, clipped and clear. 30 minutes until execution phase. Confirm overwatch readiness. Her finger hovered over the mic. She pressed once. A silent acknowledgement. Ramirez did the same. They played their parts. But inside, she felt like she was unraveling. She thought of her brother Daniel, the boy who used to chase her with sticks turned into wooden rifles. He had joined the army years before she did, full of pride and ideals. But his letters home had grown darker each time, his handwriting thinner, his hope bleeding out word by word. Until the day they stopped coming altogether. She never knew what happened to him. The silence from command was its own kind of answer. And now, staring at this village, she couldn't help but feel as if she was walking the same path. Her chest tightened. Was this how Daniel's last day had looked, watching people who had no idea what was about to fall on them? She adjusted her scope again, finding faces in windows. A girl braiding her sister's hair, a man sweeping the doorstep. They had no idea they were already written off as collateral. Ramirez shifted, his voice low. "We could warn them." Her heart lurched, and then what? "They scatter, at least some might make it." He paused, eyes hollow. "Better than waiting to burn." She wanted to believe him, but warning them meant exposure. It meant their own people would turn on them. And betrayal inside the unit never ended with a slap on the wrist. It ended in silence, erased files, names scrubbed from memory. She looked down at her hands. They were steady now. Too steady. She wondered if she had crossed some invisible line already, that moment when fear turned into resolve. 20 minutes, the radio announced. The sun was dropping fast, staining the horizon orange. Long shadows stretched across the dirt streets. She exhaled slowly, the air thick in her lungs. "Do you trust me?" she asked Ramirez quietly. He blinked at her, caught off guard. "What kind of question is that?" "Do you?" she pressed, eyes fixed on his. He hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, more than I trust them." Her throat tightened. That was enough. She reached into her vest, pulling out a small signaling device, one meant to mark a target for incoming support. But in her hand it looked like something else. A chance. A weapon not of destruction but of warning. She studied the rooftops, the alleys. If she lit it, someone might notice. Panic would ripple, families would run, and maybe, just maybe, enough would escape before the operation began. Her thumb hovered over the switch. 10 minutes, the radio snapped. Ramirez sat up straighter, his jaw clenched. "If you're going to do something," he whispered, "do it now." Her pulse hammered in her ears. She thought of her father's workshop, of her mother at the refugee gate, of Daniel's fatting handwriting, of the little girl clutching her sister's hair in the window. Then her thumb pressed down. A red flare burst into the sky, screaming against the orange horizon. It split the silence like a cry, impossible to ignore. For one breathless moment, the world froze. Then chaos erupted. Villagers shouted, doors slammed, children ran into the streets. Mothers grabbed their sons, fathers grabbed their wives. The village came alive with terror, scattering like startled birds. The radio exploded with voices. Who fired that? Who the hell fired that? She dropped the device, her chest heaving. Ramirez cursed under his breath, gripping his rifle tight. "They'll know it was us," he hissed. She knew, and yet watching the villagers flee into the hills, into the shadows where safety still might exist, she felt something she hadn't in years. Not victory, not pride, something simpler. "Hope." The radio screamed again. "Overwatch team, respond. Confirm identity of flare source immediately." She didn't press her mic. She didn't move. She simply kept watching the people run. For the first time, she wasn't just following orders. She was breaking them. And there was no going back. How far can silence stretch before it shatters into betrayal? The flare's smoke still hung in the air, twisting red into the fatting sky. She could smell the burn of its chemicals, bitter and sharp against the dust. Below, the village had transformed. What had been stillness only minutes ago was now chaos. Families spilling into alleys, men yelling, children clinging to mothers as they fled into the scrub and hills. Panic moved faster than fire. Her hands trembled as she lowered her rifle, the weight of what she had done pressing down harder than the weapon itself. She had crossed the line, not in whispers, not in silence, in light. Everyone, her team, command, the eyes above knew. Ramirez's breathing was ragged beside her. "You just put a target on both of us," he muttered, voice sharp but shaking. "They'll know. They'll hunt us down before they ever hit that village." But she didn't regret it. Not yet. Watching those families scatter into the wilderness, she felt something human crack through the soldier's shell she'd built for years. They had a chance now. A chance they wouldn't have had if she had stayed silent. The radio howled again, angrier this time. "Overwatch 2, confirm your status immediately. Failure to comply will result in consequences." Consequences. She knew exactly what that meant. Ramirez slammed his fist against the dirt. "Damn it, they'll send someone for us. You realize that?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "Would you rather we had done nothing?" His jaw clenched, eyes darting away. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was a confession of the same guilt she carried. The seconds stretched. Then a new voice came across the line, calm, colder than the others. "Overwatch 2, stand by. A recovery team is inbound." Recovery team, not reinforcements, not support. The words sat heavy in her chest. They weren't coming to help, they were coming to contain. Ramirez swore under his breath, checking the magazine in his rifle. We need to move. She scanned the ridge line. The sun was sinking fast, turning the rocks gold, shadows growing long enough to swallow them whole. If they ran now, maybe they could make the foothills before the recovery team arrived. But the net was already closing. Her heart raced, not from fear but from clarity. This was it, the moment where orders no longer protected her. The uniform no longer shielded her. She wasn't one of them anymore. "Do you hear that?" Ramirez whispered suddenly. She froze, listening. At first there was only wind and the echo of distant voices from the village. Then a low thrum, faint but growing, helicopter blades. Her stomach dropped, too fast. The recovery team was already near. She glanced at Ramirez. His face was pale, eyes darting between the horizon and her. "We're not getting out clean." She pulled the photo of her mother from her vest pocket, staring at it just long enough to steady herself. Then she tucked it back. "Then we don't run clean, we run loud." Ramirez looked at her, confused. She pointed toward the hills. "The villagers, they'll be caught in the open if that chopper gets eyes on them. We buy them time, however we can." His expression twisted between disbelief and something like admiration. "You're insane." "Maybe," she whispered, "but at least I'll know why I'm dying." The thrum grew louder, vibrating in her chest now. Dust began to kick up on the far ridge. A black dot appeared against the dimming sky, growing blades chopping the horizon apart. Ramirez set his jaw, slinging his rifle across his chest. "Fine, but if this goes bad, I'm blaming you in the afterlife." She gave the faintest smile. "Fair enough." They crawled forward, finding cover along a jagged ridge overlooking the valley. The helicopter banked lower, its spotlight flickering on, sweeping across the fleeing villagers like a predator's gaze. Her heart hammered. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to disappear, to survive. But survival for her alone was meaningless, not if it cost the lives she had just fought to protect. She steadied her scope, breath shallow. The helicopter was still high, too far for a clean shot at the cockpit. But its searchlight, that blinding eye tearing through the darkness, was vulnerable. Ramirez muttered, "You're really doing this, aren't you?" "Yes." She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night, echoing off stone. Her bullet struck metal. Sparks flew as the searchlight shattered, plunging the valley back into shadow. The helicopter jolted, banking sharply, blades roaring as it veered. Panic chatter filled her headset. "Overwatch 2, what the hell was that?" Ramirez fired next, rounds pinging against the chopper's flank. He wasn't aiming to bring it down, just to make it dance, to keep its eyes off the fleeing families. For a moment it worked. The villagers melted into darkness, swallowed by the hills. She could barely see them now, but she knew they had time. They had a chance. The helicopter circled back, angrier now, its nose dipping toward their ridge. Ramirez cursed, "They've marked us." She chambered another round, her hand steady now. No hesitation. "Then we make it costly for them." The spotlight was gone. The villagers were hidden. She had done what she came here to do. Whatever came next, she would face it without regret. Because for the first time, she wasn't carrying orders. She was carrying the weight of her own choice. Why do some choices sound like thunder in a quiet room? The ridge hummed with distant rotors and angry voices. Night pressed close, heavy with smoke and the metallic tang of spent rounds. Below, the hills swallowed the last of the fleeing villagers, their shapes small and scattered like broken beads rolling toward safety. For a sliver of time, that was enough. A single crooked victory stitched into a night full of wrongs. She sat with her back to the rock, rifle across her knees, the photo folded in her palm like a relic. Her fingers smoothed the paper, memorizing the curve of a smile she had carried across oceans and deserts. It had been a child's face once, sunburnt, stubborn, imperfect. It had kept her going when everything else tried to take her apart. Tonight it felt heavier, the weight of what she had done and what she might still have to do. Ramirez breathed in shallow bursts beside her, every exhale a punctuation mark. "They'll come down on us hard," he said, voice gravelly. "We can't hold the ridge, not against a full recovery sweep." She didn't look up. The wind carried the sound of a distant engine, close now. The night smelled like rain and ozone. "Then we make them remember why they should hesitate." A laugh, too small for the moment, escaped him. "You keep talking like that, and I'll start thinking you're actually crazy." Maybe, or maybe I'm finally tired of being quiet because it's expected, and not because it's the right thing. Her words were flat, the way a blade can be when it's been used too long. They had a plan, if anyone could call it that. Ramirez would provide covering fire and drag the others down a rocky path carved by goats, a narrow route that cut through a thorned ravine. She would stay on the ridge, keep the recovery team's attention, and pull back only when the worst of the sweep had passed. O'Neill would jam comms when their attackers tried to triangulate them. Carter would shepherd a group of villagers toward a safer pass. Hale had volunteered for the rear, his face set like flint. There were no clean goodbyes. There rarely were. The helicopter's spotlight cut the darkness into exposed veins. Metal sang against metal as rounds pinged off its underbelly, a dangerous music. The beast circled like a vulture, searching for heat signatures, sounds, anything to pin down. She checked the rifle, fingers practiced and clinical, each motion a small prayer. The flare had been the domino that broke a system built on silence. That much was obvious. What wasn't obvious was the cost. She had stolen a moment of mercy from her command, and maybe a life of peace from herself. The recovery team touched down like thunder, boots hitting stone with ruthless rhythm. Men poured from the belly of the chopper, armored and methodical, helmets reflecting the emergency lights. They moved like they'd been taught to steady fear into a formation, a machine that swallowed nuance. Her breath slowed. She found a rhythm in the noise. Breath, aim, breathe out. Her finger settled on the trigger as though it answered to a different commander, the one that watched over the small, ordinary lives that had just fled into the dark. Ricocheted light painted the canyon walls. Voices barked orders she couldn't make sense of. Their language and accents blurred into a single hostile hum. One of the recovery team's leaders flashed a torch across the ridge. White light slashed like a blade. For a heartbeat their gaze washed across her face, and she felt naked under that brightness. Then a shot cracked from their side and a crash answered from below. The recovery team had found an annoyance, Hale or maybe Carter, drawing their attention away. She didn't know. The world narrowed to the silhouette of the spotlight, the thud of rotors and the small, steady beating of her own heart. Movement to her left. A man in dark fatigue sprinted for a boulder flanked by two others. She squeezed off a round. The man bent, wheeled, cursed, spit blood, then rolled into a narrow hollow. He wasn't the target she had come for. He was a cog. That didn't make his pain any less real. "Overwatch 2, the voice sounded like glass breaking. "Identify yourselves." She could have screamed it back. She could have tried the old lines, names, call signs, proof. It would have done nothing. The command chain above them had already decided where mercy ended and operations began. Instead, she spoke another name, the one that lived folded in her hand and in the hollow where her ribs had once ached. "We are here because someone taught us what silence does." Ramirez flinched. He saw the risk. He also saw that she had already crossed it. A man came up the ridge fast, younger, breathing hard, his helmet dented. Hale. He moved like a man who decided not to leave any loose ends dangling. He didn't shout orders. He offered his grin like a barn door in a storm, then took point to cover their retreat. "We need you to move now," Hale bellowed, and the urgency in his voice broke through the night like a hammer through glass. His grin dropped. For a moment she thought she might be seeing him as he'd been before, Someone with a family, a laugh, a history that didn't include the word expendable. They ran like they had been taught too fast, silent, with the practiced choreography of people who had been doing the same morbid dance for too long. Bullets kicked up dust behind them. The recovery team shouted commands, and flash grenades bloomed like synthetic suns, swallowing shapes and reflexes. At the ravine's mouth the world thinned. They slid and clawed and tumbled down a goat path narrow as regret. She felt the photo pressing against her sternum, each fold a prayer. Behind them, a man shouted in a language she didn't know, and a sound like a crow croaked, one shot then another. Ramirez cursed when a shard of rock tore his sleeve. Carter swore like a sailor and kept moving. O'Neill's headset was silent, his palms smudged with blood and grit. Hale kept looking back, like a man counting absolution in each backward glance. They hit the thicket and suddenly the night became a cloak again, shadows an ally. Someone cried out in the dark pain, not sure if it was human or animal. She tripped. Fingers dug into roots. The world tilted. A hand closed over hers, Ramirez dragging her forward. No words, just the old muscle memory of neighbors pulling neighbors away from the edge. They spilled out into a ruined path where the fleeing villagers huddled, faces streaked with fear and ash, eyes huge and questioning. Children clung to legs. An older woman stared at her as if memorizing her for some reason her mind couldn't yet name. For a second everything slowed. The ragged breath of survivors, the soft whine of a child's sob, the distant rotors like a bad dream trying to catch up. She handed the photo to a woman who met her gaze. The woman's face was a map of years. She took the paper with careful reverence and, without a word, tucked it inside her scarf like it was a holy thing. The exchange was silent, weighty, and then gone. The woman nodded. An old vow passed between strangers in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. The rotors came closer. They saw the light sweep over their hiding place. Someone screamed. The last of the villagers pushed deeper into a gully. She should have run with them. She should have vanished into the crowd, become another borrowed shadow. But she didn't. She held her ground. They were cornered eventually, by a line of men with rifles and by the tiredness that weighs on all choices. They could have tried to fight to the last. Heroes, the movie said, would choose that. Instead, she lifted her hands when it became clear the cost of more blood would be unbearable. Ramirez followed. Carter's knees buckled. O'Neill's jaw tightened, but he mirrored her move. Hale stayed stoic, chin up. Surrender tasted bitter and strangely clean. They were hauled down to a hard light and harder questions. Men with crisp boots and younger faces demanded explanations for flares and smashed searchlights. They logged names and took photos. The world reduced to papers and stamps and signatures. They read them like obituaries. There was no honor in being processed, only bureaucracy that ate people. In the holding area, they sat on cold concrete. The night had become a small, fluorescent room with a single barred window. The recovery team's leader, a man whose face might have once smiled at family photos, stood with a formality that masked less noble intentions. "You set a diversion," he said. "You fired on an Allied asset. You compromised an operation." She looked at him, really looked, past the uniform and the medals that glittered like insect shells. "We saved a few people you intended to erase," she said. Her voice was small but not apologetic. "Is that the crime?" He studied her like a puzzle piece that didn't belong to anything he'd built. "That village was harboring an asset," he said. "People who were complicit." "People aren't assets," she answered. "Not their children, not their mothers, not the ones who put food in their mouths and told their daughters stories at night. You don't get to erase them with a checkbox." The leader's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the file on the clipboard and back to her. "You broke protocol." "Yes," her hands were steady. "I broke protocol because protocol hides murder behind euphemisms." Silence stretched like an unlit fuse. She knew there would be consequences. She knew she'd be stripped of uniform, of rank, of some imagined place inside the machine that had been her shelter. She also knew that something else had shifted irrevocably. A small deer of mercy had been coaxed out into the open, and it would not return to the dark. Hours later, after interrogations, after being processed and catalogued, she saw him again. Not the target they had chased through smoke and fire, but the man who had spoken to her in that compound weeks ago, the one whose eyes had been calm in the dark. He walked into the same room where they'd sat, flanked by guards, but he wasn't walking free. They had taken him too. Fate and war have a way of folding the world into strange coincidences. His face was older than in the briefing photos. There was a tired dignity about him that didn't fit the label the military had given him. When his gaze found hers across the room, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "You carry a photo like that?" he asked quietly, not a challenge but a recognition. She blinked. How did he know? He had known once before. His voice had found the hollow inside her, numbing the weight she'd buried. Now, behind the bright lights and the paperwork, the look between them was softer, stripped of the rage of bullets. Something like understanding passed across his face. "You recognized it," she said. Her voice sounded like paper. He nodded. His hands were cuffed, but his posture retained a strange calm. "I remember a camp," he said. "A line of people. A small girl with a stubborn smile. Families pushed aside by men who thought themselves bigger than grief." "You were," she stopped, because lines in briefing books weren't the same as the knots inside real men. The enemy on a map can be a neighbor in another life. She had been raised to see edges and not the middle. He smiled, and it was not cruel. "Once, I carried food between lines for months. I learned what silence does to a child." He paused, looking at the photo she had left folded between pages. "You carry it like a prayer." "You said I carried more than my orders," she said. "What did you mean?" He let that settle a moment. "Because I recognized someone who had chosen to act when the world told her to be still." His voice was softer than she expected. "I recognized a person who knew that dignity doesn't have to scream to be heard." The guards moved them apart then, their small exchange a loose thread the bureaucracy could not catalog. She was processed further, stamps and lists and a strip of numbers tacked to a file. Yet his words sat inside her, small and luminous. Dignity doesn't have to scream. That night, in a cell that smelled of dust and old coffee, she closed her eyes and let the silence come for a different reason. It was not the silence of concealment or armor. It was a quiet of consequence. There would be hearings, consequences of uniforms and codes. Her name would be on files and whispers. Friends might turn away. She might lose the job that had been a shape for her life. But she had saved faces she would never know. Faces that would sleep beneath different stars because of her light. And in the smallest exchange, an old woman tucking a paper into her scarf, there was a rebellion that no order could stamp out. When the guards opened the cell the next morning, they brought papers and a new set of uniforms. Her hands were steady as she took them. She folded the photo, kissed it once and tucked it inside the seam of her shirt. It would stay there, warm and folded against her ribs, even if envelopes and stamps tried to erase her. They led her away. Ramirez walked with her a few paces, then stopped. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A nod passed between them, less a goodbye than a covenant stamped in the dark. As she stepped into the daylight, a journalist's flash or the quick angle of a camera might have caught something, something like regret or defiance or perhaps both. She did not know what the world would call her tomorrow. Hero, traitor, coward, savior. Labels were brittle. But in the quiet that followed, when the rotors had returned to their distant humming, and the village rested under ragged blankets of stars, she felt something settle into her, a small, steady certainty. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She closed her eyes one last time before the doors shut, breathing in the same air that had once been full of commands and later full of the soot of choices. Her silence had changed. Once it had been a refuge, a tool. Now it was a witness. Outside, the wind moved through the hills and carried distant laughter, broken, relieved, human. Inside her chest, the photograph warmed against her heart, a small promise folded into paper. She had chosen a silence that yelled where it mattered, and in that noise, she found a different kind of peace.